Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. The Supreme Court has handed down many controversial decisions from the very first time that it overruled an act of Congress declaring it unconstitutional. That was the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803 under Chief Justice John Marshall. We talked about that in an earlier dispatch, and it's continued all through American history, of course, from Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education, to more recent cases where the court declared on the constitutionality of universal health care and voting rights and abortion, with many more decisions to come that will be controversial. This month marks the anniversary, the 164th anniversary of one of the most controversial cases in American history, one that constitutional scholars call the worst decision the Supreme Court ever handed down, and one that led directly to civil war. It's the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who lived in Missouri with an army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson. Dr. Emerson took Dred Scott to the free state of Illinois and then on to the free territory of Wisconsin. Dred Scott got married there in Wisconsin. He and his wife, after about 4 years, came back to Missouri with Dr. Emerson. After the doctor's death, they became the property of his widow, who refused to sell Dred Scott and his wife their freedom. With the help of an abolitionist lawyer, Dred Scott took the case to court, claiming freedom after having lived in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. It worked its way through state and federal courts. Mrs. Emerson eventually transferred ownership to a relative named John Sandford, who lived in a different state, giving the Supreme Court jurisdiction in the case. Now, recall that Missouri came into the Union through the Missouri Compromise. It wanted to come in as a slave state. That would upset the balance between free and slave states in Congress. Maine eventually came in as a free state at the same time, but Congress ruled in the compromise that none of the other territories north of Missouri's southern border at latitude 3630 would ever come in as anything other than free states. That compromise had held since 1820. During the 1850s, of course, the United States was tearing itself apart politically over the issue of the extension of slavery into territories. Chief Justice Roger Taney of Maryland handed down his decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford on March 6, 1857, just 2 days after James Buchanan was inaugurated as president, and it was a bombshell of a decision. Justice Taney ruled that not only was Dred Scott not due his freedom, he said that African Americans were not, had never been, would never be citizens of the United States and therefore had no standing to sue in her courts. He said also that blacks, quote, have no rights which any white man is bound to respect, unquote. He went further than that and ruled that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, that Congress never had the right to forbid slavery in any territory. Justice Taney hoped that by imposing a judicial solution on a political problem that he would put this contentious issue of slavery to bed once and for all. And of course, it had just the opposite effect. The white South embraced the decision as a prayer answered, that this once and for all settled the issue as to whether or not territories would be slave or free. The white North exploded in outrage, both in public opinion and in the press, that this was a huge issue of judicial overreach and an outrage against freedom. And of course, it helped stoke the fires that eventually led to civil war 4 years later. Dred Scott eventually got his freedom when ownership was transferred to another family, but he didn't live long to enjoy it. He died just 1 year later of tuberculosis and is buried in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. His wife, Harriet, lived until 1876, lived long enough to see the Civil War and the 13th Amendment put an end to slavery in the United States. In 1997, Dred and Harriet Scott were inducted into St. Louis's Walk of Fame. The Dred Scott case, decided 164 years ago this month, another stepping stone on the long walk to freedom for African Americans in the United States. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.